To say a few words about G.Patka, he was born in Vienna, and after studying contemporary history, he ended up in 1998 becoming the curator of the Jewish Museum in Vienna. And then in 2002, he was made a Mason in Lodge Voltaire. Since 2015, he's been the worshipful master of Lodge Quattro Coronati in Vienna and the editor of its annual yearbook. No mean feat, it runs to about 300 or 400 pages, so it's enough to really keep him out of mischief. This evening, we also have a discussant, Helge Bjorn Horisland, who's a Norwegian Masonic historian, and he specializes in the Masonic history of the 20th century and also works as an international repatriation coordinator for the Association of Masonic Museums, Libraries and Archives in Brussels. He's a member and officer of the Norwegian Lodge of Research, Niels Tresco in Oslo, and a member of several other research lodges, including Quattro Coronati. He's a retired ship's agent, so we can expect a broad international perspective from him this evening, I'm sure. Helge will offer his personal perspective on Marcus's presentation, pose a few questions for the question and answer session after that. My guess is that most of you will be here this evening wondering why the name of Aachen should appear in a talk from Vienna. But of course, when I see the names of Eugen Lennhoff of Austria and Ossian Lang from New York, then I know immediately that we're involved in part of the campaign that took place between the world wars to try and find Masonic peace amongst the Grand Lodges of Europe, with the thought also that the values of Freemasonry itself might offer a positive contribution to that process. But that's enough from me, and I'd like to hand over to Marcus, and the screen is all yours, Marcus. Marcus, would you like to unmute yourself?
No. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. So I had to put away this one. Okay. Okay, thank you, John, for this introduction. You see, first I want to mention the positive aspect of the COVID crisis, because I found most of this material I'm talking about today in 2004 in Berlin, and it was one of these things where you say, okay, when I have time, I will make an article out of it. So now the time came, and it was the right moment, and so I made at the end I wrote some 250 pages, or let's say it's many quotations. I compiled this topic. So I'm talking about the conference of Aachen, which took place on the 22nd of June in 1928. Its only goal was, so to say, to emphasize a stylization of the ideological struggle between Freemasonry and the Catholic Church. And the main person around it is Kurt Reichl, but he is, so to say, the anti-hero of my talk, because he was a very famous Freemason in Vienna. But in 1934, he stepped out. Then he worked for the Catholic Church, and then in 1935 he was hired by the SS, and he was taken to Berlin, and he was working in the Reich Sicherheitshauptamt in Berlin, and he was, so to say, the only informal informant on Freemasonry there for the SS. So his release, he wrote many thousand pages of papers there, and all these papers are now divided in Bundesarchiv Lichterfelde, in Geheimes Preußische Staatsarchiv. Some parts are in the Institute for National Memory in Poland. Copies of that are in the United States Holocaust Museum. Some parts are in Moscow. Okay. we are talking about, okay, it was a dialogue between Freemasons and the Jesuits. So, and we could add that they seem to be kind of the intellectual elite of two different, of two opponents, ideological opponents. And still in the 18th century, this fight started, so to say. Here in Vienna, it was the Jesuits who ran the university, and that maybe was the main reason why the lodge was a kind of academy. It was, they wanted to bring the idea of enlightenment. So first, we're going to start with the participants of this Aachen conference. And we have picture number 1. No, we have no picture number 1. Okay, Kurt Reichl, he was... Okay. No, that's not what I want. Kurt Reichl lived from 1899 to 1956. He was born in a kind of German national and Catholic surroundings in the province outside of Vienna. He studied philosophy, he became a doctor, and in 1922 he became a brother Freemason. He was a kind of shooting stars because he was very brilliant and very intelligent. And yes, but as I mentioned before, he was forced to leave in February 1934 because of debts to younger brother. He got money and he didn't pay it back. And about his later life, I will tell you later on. The second participant from the Freemason side was Eugen Lennhoff, who lived from 1891 to 1944. He was a Swiss-born Jew. He was the head of the Universelle Freimaurer-Liga, who had its congress in Vienna in 1928. Besides that, he was the editor of the Wiener Freimaurer-Zeitung from 1923 to 1933. He also was the sovereign grand commander of the Scottish Rite, the first one here in Austria from 1925 to 29. So he was a kind of foreign minister in a way. He was a really important official, and he wanted to become the architect of European-wide or worldwide Freemasonry, whatever. Also, well, he stepped out of the lodge in November 1933. The reasons are not really clear, but probably it was Hitler's race to power that he realized that all his dreams were falling apart. He became a very severe anti-Nazi later on and had to escape to England in 1938, where he wrote several books. Third participant was Ossian Lang, British-born. He was the Grand Historian of the Grand Lodge of New York, and also he was a kind of foreign minister as he traveled to Hungary and to Syria to re-establish Freemasonry there. What is important, all of them were members of the Scottish Rite, which makes the whole project very suspicious for the Nazis, of course, because the Scottish Rite had an international organization. From the Catholic side, there was only one person, and that was Helmand Gruber. Helmand Gruber, he was Austrian-born, was the #1 specialist on anti-Freemasonic writing of that time. He was also a part of the Taxil hoax, but maybe this is going too far. When these talks took place, he was a professor in Aalbeck, in a Jesuit college. But he died in 1930, so he was only a short time in this dialogue. His close friend was Enrico Rosa, another Jesuit who was the editor of the Civita Cattolica in the Vatican, the newspaper. And so they exchanged many letters, but I didn't find them until yet. And there are also 2 other Jesuits, French Jesuits. Then their names are the Padres Bonsirven and Massé, and they were publishing in the French Jesuit paper Études Religieuses. After Gruber died, another Jesuit took his place, and that was Friedrich Mukherman, who lived from 1883 to 1946. Mukherman was very different because he was a great orator. He also was a kind of politician. He was a very severe anti-communist, first because religion was forbidden in the Soviet Union. And later on, he also became a very strong anti-Nazi. Because of that, he had to flee Germany in 1934 to the Netherlands, From there, some of his writings were smuggled into Germany, and because of that, he had to escape another time to France in 1933, where he was hidden in monasteries and where he was writing his autobiography, which I'm going to mention later. So Hermann Gruber, there is only, his release is very small. I looked it up in Munich in the Jesuit archive, but there is nothing on these debates. But what is evident that he was in contact with many brother Freemasons from all over Europe, and he used a pseudonym, of course. But so it was Gruber who, in 1925, also wrote to Dietrich Bischoff, who was the head of the Verein Deutscher Freimaurer, a very eminent organization then in Germany. And he wanted to start a dialogue with him. And but Gruber, he kind of attacked the Freemasonic humanity principle, because up to him, this would lead to anarchy. So, but Bischoff himself, he was a Protestant, first of all, and so he was not interested to have any discussion with a Jesuit. And for his position, he was against any kind of dogmatism coming from Rome, and he was more, he wanted to enforce a German national church. After that, also in 26, Gruber wrote a series of articles in the Viennese Catholic journal Neues Reich. There he refers to the new encyclica Quas Primas from 1925, and his motto was, in Latin, interficite errores diligite errantes, which means fight the error, but love the erring. And that means he was not against Freemasons as individuals, but he was against an attitude of mind. And of course, he was against the institution and the organization, because for him, Freemasonry was an apostasy from Christianity. So Gruber equates Freemasonry and liberalism. For him, Freemasonry was a kind of esoteric liberalism, and liberalism, on the other side, was the exoteric Freemasonry. Up to him, a secret society cannot contain any truth. So the secrecy is the problem. And this was the point, he accuses Freemasonry only of deism and not of atheism anymore, as it was in many other Catholic publications of that time. And Gruber also started to write a letter to Reichl. And Reichl in Vienna, I told you he was a kind of shooting star and very intellectual. He wrote a series of articles in the Wiener Freimaurer-Zeitung. The first one was Freemasonry and Atheism. And there he raises a very interesting question, because we all know that according to our principles, a Freemason should not be a stupid atheist. But up to Reichl, the emphasis decides, because does that mean that any atheist is stupid? Or does it mean that there is also a non-stupid atheist, so a kind of intelligent atheism? So Reichl separates faith from knowledge, and atheism for him is only the criticism of a dogmatic interpretation of faith. In the next article, Freemasonry and Catholicism, Reichl summarizes the new point of view of Gruber. Maybe you could show this quotation. Yeah. So up to Reichl, Gruber says the essentials of modern speculative Freemasonry are, first, the allegedly religiously and denominationally neutral, in fact, supranaturalistic, practically adogmatic and anti-dogmatic character common to all modern fundamental liberalism. Second, its naturalistic humanitarian fundamental principle. And third, its deistic basic idea. So Reichl sees secularism and this world culture not as reproach. For him, and this is another quotation, Freemasonry is ethics of disintegration, consecration for the finite, not ethics of resignation and consecration for the infinite. It is an ethics of earthliness and not of earth's volatility. And from its deistic metaphysics, it seems its way symbolized not from God, but up to God. So Reichl was a Catholic himself. In another article, Philosophy of Freemasonry, he writes that Freemasonry was not driven by a dogmatic will to power, but by the search for a non-partisan and supranational morality. They exchanged many letters. I only found the letters from Gruber to Reichl, the other ones disappeared. And in a letter from 27, Gruber criticizes again the secrecy about Freemasonry, but he also mentions that Vienna is a big exception, because Grand Lodge of Vienna was very open in writing about itself and in the Wiener Freimaurer-Zeitung and so on. And we can see from these letters that already there were the first attacks on Gruber from the Catholic sides, from the kind of right-wing and anti-Semitic Catholic sides. And this became very evident in June 1926. There was the French magazine Revue Internationale des Sociétés Secrètes. They very much referred to the protocols of the Elders of Zion, which was a kind of Bible for them. They were writing, for them, Freemasonry was the synagogue of Satan, and they used the term Judeo-Freemasonry and things like this that you later find with the Nazis and so on. And there were several articles also on this dialogue, because they have been reading the articles of Reichl in the Wiener Freimaurer-Zeitung. So they really, this magazine really was from the camp of, you can call it a völkischer Katholizismus. They also quoted Ludendorff. And so these articles were written by a Jesuit. His name was Ernest Juin. And in his letters, Gruber defends this Ernest Juin because they knew each other for decades. They were fighting Freemasonry for many years. But on the other side, Reichl defends Gruber against these attacks in the Wiener Freimaurer-Zeitung. So despite that, on the 22nd of June in 1928, this Aachen conference took place. There was no records, and the only outcome was that the debate between the two ideological opponents should become more academic and non-aggressive. It should be a stylization of this dispute. So the correspondence was going on, and from this we learned that Gruber kind of proselytizes his surrounding, which means he talked to his students and to any kind of prominent person around, that he was in contact now with the Freemasons and that they started a dialogue. But we can also read out other disturbances. And then something else happened, because this Friedrich Mukherman, this other Jesuit, he wrote an article in the Neue Freie Presse, which was a Viennese newspaper, a very eminent one, very liberal, and many journalists there have been Freemasons. And the title of this article was Liberalism and Catholicism, where he, how to say, wrote quite sympathetic, about liberalism. So out of this, Reichl thought that he reads out an offer to reconciliation, because if Muckerman accepts liberalism, then maybe also Freemasonry. But this maybe was too much, because what followed next is that Muckerman wrote an article in the Bavarian newspaper, and there he kind of unveiled the whole debate on all this meeting in Aachen. The title of this article was Canossagang in Aachen. And this was that the debate really came the first time to a big public, because before it was only in the Wiener Freimaurer-Zeitung. And according to Muckerman, he writes in this article that Freemasonry had suffered shipwreck with the communists and the socialists, who are obviously the children of liberalism. And therefore, in this weak situation, they were coming to the church. What follows were also some letters between Reichl and Muckerman. And there have been meetings between them. There's evidence about that. And then Reichl, who wanted to continue this dialogue, he wrote articles against communism in the Wiener Freimaurer-Zeitung, because in the year of 1930, you know, there were very severe, very violent riots in Spain and in Mexico. Churches and monasteries were burned down, and in this time, Freemasons have been part of the government, and so of course they were accused of standing behind that. Of course, and Reich he even wrote the names of these ministers in his articles, but he says no, they tried to stop this violence, but they could not. And Mukherman had his own magazine. He published himself and wrote himself. Its name was The Grail. And his main point is he's very much against the Freemasonic idea of humanitarianism. Then, because of these point of views, they couldn't get closer. The whole debate was losing the momentum in 1931. Besides, the Wiener Freimaurer-Zeitung was greatly reduced in 1933 because of the clerical fascist regime in Austria, and also because Lennhoff stepped out from publishing this magazine, and also for other reasons. So what Reichl did, as he could not publish as much anymore, he made many travels. He went to the Austrian province, he went to Prague and to Germany, and he had kind of lectures in the lodges there to enforce his idea and his project. There were also in other important publications which mentioned this dialogue. There was the book The Power and Secrets of Jesuits by the journalist René Philipp Miller. And he writes, of course, the church could not go with ideas like denominational neutrality or a naturalistic ideal of humanity. But again, he mentions that instead of godlessness, the accusation is only deism. And Lennhoff, he wrote about the Aachen talks in his book, The Freemasons in 1929, and also, of course, in an international lexicon of Freemasonry in 32, and there were also some other publications. So what Reichl did next, in the year of 1933, he published a so-called Blaubuch der Weltfreimaurerei, the Blue Book of World Freemasonry. And the main part of this book is his, sorry. Is his point of view on this debate. But if you read it carefully, you could see that he only was rewriting all his articles in the Wiener Freimaurer-Zeitung, but he told the story from back to front. Then there also followed another Blaubuch in 1934. There is a quite interesting article in there by Karl Wagner from Prague on Freemasonry and Catholicism, and he calls for an enlightened Catholicism in Vienna in the year of 1934. This is quite something when we had this clerical fascist regime. In April 1934, there were a number I looked up also the magazine Die Drei Ringe, the Three Rings of the Czechoslovakian German-speaking Grand Lodge Lessing to the Three Rings. And in April 1934, this volume is very interesting because on page 85, you find a very bashful short note that both Reichl and Lennhoff resigned from the lodge. This really must have been a kind of earthquake because they were the most eminent and the most prominent members of Grand Lodge of Vienna, and they had their international projects. But in the same number of this volume of Drei Ringe, there are three articles on this Aachen debates, very, very interesting, very intelligent, but their point of view, so to say, is there is much understanding for this project, but at the end, there were irreconcilable viewpoints, and they were asking why didn't they see this before. Okay, as I mentioned before, Kurt Reichl had to step out of Freemasonry. And you see, he also, he liked to go to fancy restaurants and to spend a lot of money. Also, the Nazis point that out in their later reports on him. And so, yeah, he needed money. And so he went to the Catholic side, to the Jesuits. And it very much looks alike that he was hired by Mukherman himself now to write a brochure against the talks of Aachen. So this he wrote under the pseudonym Gregor Cardon, and the title is Are Jesuits Freemasons? So he retells the whole story, but now from the perspective of the church. He starts with the term Canossagang that Mukherman used in his article, and he opposes the possible view that the church forgave Freemasonry, and he claims that Freemasonry came to the church because of its precarious situation. This brochure also mentions that the author was in possession of the Gruber estates, which is lost, so to say. In the meantime, maybe it went to Mukherman later on, but it's lost. And this brochure also mentions that Freemasonry also wanted to drive a wedge into the Catholic front. Now that they were writing very, very sympathetic on this Revue Internationale des Sociétés Secrètes. I mean, they have opponents inside of the Catholic. Okay, now a quotation from this brochure. The lodge wears a distinctly Janus face, while it, above all in Central Europe, through some of its leading men and through its press, had conversations with outstanding representatives of the church and urged them to reduce the opposition to Freemasonry. At the same time, a serious cultural struggle was being waged under Masonic governments against Catholicism in Mexico and Spain. While Freemasonry, on the one hand, went on a Canossagang to Father Helmand Gruber in Aachen, on the other hand, the Masonic president of Mexico, Elias Calles, against the Catholics. While through the Masonic press and the liberal dailies close to it, the imagination of some minds had received the refreshing stimulus to speak of a pact between Jesuits and Freemasons. At the same time, in Spain, almost a Masonic republic was proclaimed, and the Jesuit order was expelled from the country at Masonic instigation. So Mukherman probably was the man behind this brochure, and he also wrote a review on it. And there, this is the next quotation, Gregor Cardon, which is Kurt Reichl, was until recently the holder of all the high degrees of international Freemasonry, but then turned to Catholicism and finally became truly Catholic. Cardon's little writing deals only with the Aachen talks and all the attempts made by Freemasonry to deceive the Catholic Church and bring about a new Leo Taxil hoax. But as Mukherman also was hoaxing in a way, because in his autobiography, which was published much later after his death, he writes also about his meetings with Reichl. And there he writes, Mukherman was picked up by a small, very elegantly dressed Jewish lawyer, still at late night meeting. This man seemed to me to be a kind of Mephisto, with a tempting smile, with somewhat prancing manner, the tip of his tailcoat moving back and forth like a little tail. In any case, it was Dr. Reichl, editor of the Viennese Masonic newspaper, high graduate of the Scottish Rite. I mean, Mukherman knew that Reichl was Catholic, and that he describes him as a Jewish lawyer. Well, it doesn't give a very good image of him. So there were also other reactions to this whole debate, or let's say this kind of press war, more or less. So there were two brochures in the year 1934. There was a kind of Fritz Walter. The title is "The Catholic Church in League with Freemasonry?" ? This was a Catholic publication, similar to the one of Gregor Cardon, but the tone was much sharper. It was full of lies and distortions, and it accuses Freemasonry of being in league with communism. But also the National Socialists woke up, and there was a guy called Heinz Igler, and he wrote a brochure, Roman Church and Bolshevism, the Aachen Conference. It was number 17 of the series Völkisches Erwachen. And he also attacks Muckermann for, well, he attacks Muckermann for concealing his original role. It went on under the Nazi regime. I mean, first maybe there was a very high-ranking SS officer was Franz Alfred Six. He was a professor at the university. Where was it, in Königsberg, and he was a kind of SS intellectual. And he published a pamphlet with the title Freemasonry and Church in 1940. And not only he postulates a pact between the lodge and the church against a National Socialism, which of course for him, from his point of view, was very offensive. So, but he used this in the propaganda. But not only that he postulates this, he was quoting verbatim from Reichl's protocol. I could prove it. It's really word by word what Reichl was typing. You can find in this book. And so, yeah, we see that Reichl has contributed massively to the official image of the Nazi state about Freemasonry. What happened to Reichl in the meantime? You see, between 1935 and 1937, he was writing reports for the SS. Then, after the Anschluss of Austria, the SS, of course, also they found the archive. They stole the archive of Grand Lodge of Vienna, and then they realized that Reichl was lying to them why he stepped out of the lodge. Because of Reichl said that he stepped out because he became a true National Socialist. What is true or not, it doesn't matter. I think Reichl was only writing for money, and whatever he wrote was full of lies. And so after the SS found out this, Reichl was arrested and put to prison for more than a year. But then he was kind of reactivated, because one of the officers he was sending reports to was Helmut Knochen, and Helmut Knochen later on became the chief of the security of the SS security system in the occupied France. And he took Reichl there to work for him and to convince the Catholic side from the National Socialist point of view or of cooperation with the church. So and then suddenly Reichl also was dealing with the Jesuits from the Revue Internationale de Société Secrète. And maybe Muckerman realized that. He was also in France, but hidden in a monastery. But that's another question. After the war, Reichl came back to Austria, and he came to Vienna, and some people recognized him. And there was accusations that he was working with the Nazis, but he said, me, I have been a Freemason, and as a Freemason, it was forbidden to become a member of the Nazi party. So there was no evidence, and he was left free, but he kind of died shortly after that. What is quite interesting, that also after 45, the spirit of Aachen was prolonged. There was a French Jesuit, Joseph Berthelot. He wrote several books. One of them was Jesuit and Franc-Maçon, Souvenir d'une amitié. And he really writes in the spirit of Aachen, and he also mentions the little booklet, Lettre au Souverain Pontife by Albert Lantoine from 1937, where a Freemason wrote to the Pope in a similar way. But also here came a very sharp counterattack by the church, and it was Vicomte Léon de Poncin in his book Freemasonry and the Vatican. He attacks all the Jesuits, and he names many of them who are too sympathetic with Freemasonry. So I'm coming to the end, to my resume, and you also find it here. Leaving aside the discrediting of the whole enterprise by Reichl's betrayals, one could ask, what is the relevance of it today? The stylization of the ideological dispute between church and Freemasonry has been implemented in the present. This may be related to the largely peaceful change in world politics since World War II, but also to the extensive socio-cultural marginalization of the two adversaries as a result of a lack of qualified new blood and internal fractionalization. De facto, there are a large number of Freemasons worldwide who profess Catholicism. De jure, they would all have to be excommunicated by the church. And already in 1928, it has been shown that a progressive wing of the church can enter into dialogue with a traditional wing of Freemasonry, but that the respective other wing in their own institution massively hinders this. Therefore, only their realization would remain. It cannot grow together what does not belong together, but what can also live peacefully side by side. How little Kurt Reichl had achieved is also shown in a theological encyclopedia published in 1932, in which it is stated, Freemasonry rejects the Catholic Church as the true Church of Christ, denies in its dogmatic tolerance the absolute character of Christianity, and because it is rationalistic and predominantly anthropocentric, harbors the danger of complete religious indifference and even of free thinking, which actually grew into actual hostility to God in Romanist Freemasonry. This is why the Catholic Church condemns Freemasonry and forbids joining it under excommunication. So I'm at the end of my lecture. This is the short version. If you want to read the full version in German, it's in the yearbook of Quarto Coronati Vienna. It's some 250 pages. So yeah, I thank you for listening. And yeah, I'm wondering how the discussion is going to be. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Marcus, for that fascinating story. It's so complicated and sad in a way that nothing came out of it of a lasting nature. But at least there were efforts being made, and not all of them paid off. But I'd like to now to bring Helge Horrisland into the picture and ask him to give another perspective on the same material, perhaps to ask a couple of questions, and to then we will initiate any questions from the audience. So Helge, would you like to unmute?
Yes, thank you, John, and good evening all. It's a fascinating topic, this Aachen conference. It is quite well known in certain circles in European Masonic circles, but I think on the other side of the ocean, it's not so much known, even though one of the participants, Ossian Lang, is a very much known a Freemason. I think it is important to emphasize as a start that as this conference was held in 1928, Nazism is still a very small political movement, both in Germany and in Austria. When you come to 1930, they start beginning to be bigger parties, but in 1928, they are still not in the picture. I have a question for Marcus. Some are describing the Aachen conference as an anti-Masonic event. What is your opinion on that topic?
Well, I don't think it was anti-Masonic. You see, Reichl, then he was a true Masonic and he was very enthusiastic about it. The problem was more, it was his private initiative, and all these talks were private, and Gruber did not have any official backing from, not even not from the Jesuit order and not from the Vatican. And it seems more that, how to say, there was an old man and a young man, and somehow there was a kind of intellectual relation between them. So, and each one together, maybe they wanted to have the success to end this struggle between church and Freemasonry, but of course this was an illusion. And Gruber died, but Reichl was going on. It was the big topic of his life, and he invested so much energy and probably money and what else, that he couldn't stop with it. And then when later on, when he was working for the Nazi, this was his big, how to say it, his big asset, because he had a secret knowledge, so to say, and he proclaimed that there is something going on against the Nazis. There is a pact between these two worldwide powers, the Lodge and the Church, but it was a big hoax. It was only to make money and to profit for himself. I mean, in 1928, of course, no, it was not anti-Masonic. It was really, they really tried to come closer to each other, but it was not possible, because also when you read all these written discussions, I mean, each one has its own arguments, but you realize that there is nothing. They have nothing in common.
Okay, I have another comment or another question here. Looking at the Aachen conference from the Catholic side, the Catholic Church official, has the Aachen conference, in the time after it was held, influenced how the Catholic Church is looking at Freemasonry up to our times?
Well, the attitude changed. This I mentioned in my finishing words. I mean, you see, today we even in Vienna we have a Catholic priest who is a member of the lodge, and he wrote a book also on this. His name is Wiener. And you would not find this very aggressive tone like Synagogue of Satan. This really is 19th century up to after the Nazis. I mean, probably after the catastrophe of World War II, the two opponents realized that, how to say, that this struggle is in vain, so to say. But this is de facto, I mean, Freemasons in Austria get buried on a Catholic cemetery. It's forbidden de jure, but it happens. So you see, many things changed, but not in the rules. I mean, it's still the Freemason has to face excommunication and not to be buried, yeah, in a Catholic cemetery if he dies, yeah. It depends on the priest, but the priest is more understanding than the Vatican.
Okay. Now a comment on Ossian Lang. As an American, probably between the wars, the American Mason that knew most of European Freemasonry. What would you say that his contribution is in this aspect? You talked a lot about the other participants at the Aachen conference, but not so much about Ossian Lang. Could you add some facts about him? He is not so much known in Europe, sorry to say, but he's a big shot in American Freemasonry still.
Yeah, you see, we don't know too much about Ossian Lang. He was traveling around, and he kind of came of last minute into this group. But of course, he was very eminent, and maybe it had also to do with that Hermann Gruber before World War 1991, he wrote an article about Freemasonry in a Catholic encyclopedia, in which he writes very much about American Freemasonry and about that there are many Catholics in there, and that for them this is no problem, and also for the church there it is not a problem to be in both organizations. So maybe that was the reason. You see, Ossian Lang, he was traveling a lot, and so he was in Vienna and then in Prague and in Hungary, but he also exchanged letters with Gruber. There is evidence about this, but I have seen only one of them. You see, I did not see all the material that was later kind of stolen by the Nazis. Maybe you could find it in the United States Holocaust Museum. They have the copies of all the files in Poland. So I don't know too much what was his role in there.
Could I add a little bit else about Ossian Lang, please? If you look back to the early 1920s, he was very active in the Association Internationale Masonique, which was basically ran out of Switzerland, and he represented the Grand Lodge of New York, and they were the big force of, I'll call it regular Freemasonry, together with the Grand Orient of the Netherlands. And when that sort of collapsed, he then tended to move from the Association into the Universelle Freimaurer-Zeitung League. And that's probably how he came to appear in Austria, in particular, the relationship he had with Lennhoff on that particular aspect.
For sure, yeah, but like I mentioned before, you see, Reichl, he never again wrote about Lennhoff and Ossian Lang. In all his reports for the Nazis, I think I did not find these names anymore, for whatever reasons. And there is also no release of Reichl. He mentioned after the war, when he was put on trial, he said, oh, all my suitcases got lost or were stolen on the train. So there, I could prove the evidence, but I cannot because all the papers are gone. So for me, in this story, Lang comes in, and maybe he should have been propagated all this idea, this dialogue in the United States. Maybe it was the idea that you have Lennhoff as the main European Freemason and Lang from the United States to make a bridge over the ocean.
I've got a few more questions coming up here. Dudley Tucker asks, are you aware of any Nazis who were secretive Freemasons?
Nazis who have been secretive Freemasons. Yes, there was another case in Vienna. His name was Franz Papetz, and that's also related to the Aachen conference. That's quite interesting because this man, he went into the same lodge as Lennhoff and Reichl, the Lodge Zukunft, and in 1943 he wanted to become a member of the Nazi party, but it was denied. Why? Because he was a member in a Masonic lodge before, and then he wrote, I only went in there because I wanted to get the information on this Aachen conference from Reichl and so on, but they didn't believe him. And I mean, yes, and even in 1933, I mean, the Nazis knew all the names of Austrian worshipful masters. So there have been informants, but there always have been informants. In 1929, there was a big book published in Austria and written from the Nazi point of view against Freemasonry, and it's very informative. I mean, all the names are true. I mean, of course, there are many lies also and accusations, but the basic is quite well informed. So yeah, there was a kind of intelligence work against the Freemasons also in Vienna at that time.
Helge, do you have any comments to make on other?
Well, Brother Dudley is asking, are you aware of any Nazis who were secretive Freemasons? If we're going, if we are looking at Europe in general, of course there were, but and there were also high officials
Yeah.
Nazis, Forster and Greiser. Greiser, for instance, who was one of the big culprits in Poland and was responsible for hundreds of thousands of deaths there. He was member of a lodge in Silesia, and he never left the lodge as such. So, in principle, he was a Freemason through his whole career. So that is a special part, of course. Yeah, I have no further questions for Marcus. Thank you, Marcus. And over to you, John.
Okay, there's one more question here. It asks, did Opus Dei, which was founded in 1928, play any part in the discussions between the Church and Freemasons?
What was founded in 28?
Opus Dei.
Opus Dei. No, I don't think so. I don't think so. But to the other question before, you see, I want to work next on the Deutsche Gemeinschaft in Vienna. The Deutsche Gemeinschaft was founded in 1990. It was also a very much National Socialist organization. They shared all these ideas. And in one of their papers, I found the sentence, we have to copy the Freemasons because they are so successful, they operate worldwide. We also have to make a kind of system with lodges and secret signs and so on. So it really seemed to me that the Nazis, that they believed their own propaganda about Freemasonry after World War I and so on, and then so they even copied it. And also, yeah, also there's, as some people say, they copied the Jesuit order with, yeah, in the way they acted amongst them other.
Right. Do we have any more questions? I can't see any coming up. Helge, do you have any other points you want to raise?
My favorite here is Ossian Lang. And I think it is worthwhile for European Freemasonry to dig into his life and what he did. After the Aachen Conference in 28, American Freemasonry began to get interested in Freemasonry in Europe. You have this wave of recognitions of American Grand Lodges all over Europe, and Ossian Lang's participation in this work is essential. Therefore, he is, in my opinion, one of the big guys and should be studied more from the European side.
I think he's hardly studied at all. It's quite surprising, really, when you look at the role he played.
Exactly. In Europe, he's not known very much, but he's a big name in American Freemasonry. But his role in Europe should be studied definitely much more. He has influenced this recognition wave that came in the 1930s, but also after the Second World War, his work was essential in establishing European Freemasonry with American help in the 1940s and 50s.
Right, if there are no more questions, I'd like to say a very big thank you to Marcus for introducing us to a topic which most of us were not familiar with. And it's interesting to see that apart from the inter-Masonic discussions, that there were discussions between the Church and Freemasons as well, even if they came to nothing. Thank you, Marcus, for your time and effort in that. and it's your big work seems to have a lot more material in it. And thank you, Helge, for your comments and your questions as well. I look forward to seeing you all again next month. Thank you for being with us this evening. Good night.
Thank you. Thank you for coming and listening. Thank you.